Hello, thank you so much, guys, for joining me in this live video. I am so glad that you took your time to come and join me. I just want to set up something here and see if this mic, then if you can hear me, because I am able to actually, hear myself. I can hear myself from this side, so I'm not so sure about you guys. Okay, thank you so much. Of late, you have seen me, I think, talk a lot about indigenous education, and indigenous education without actually saying what indigenous education is. So, to do justice to this subject, I'm going to talk about what education is in general, and then I'll talk about indigenous education. And then I'll talk about some of the issues that relate to indigenous education, especially in Africa, where we seem to have neglected indigenous education. So, to start with, what is education? What do you think education is? I think, in my own view, I will not give you my own definition, but my own perspective is geared towards what Kremin said about education. He said that education in general is a deliberate, systematic, and sustained effort to transmit knowledge, provoke or acquire knowledge, values, attitudes, skills, or sensibilities. So when you look at what education is and it is able to offer as a term, it is something that helps individuals to get empowered in one way or another, with skills, with knowledge. And it is not just a matter of having the knowledge, it is just not a matter of having skills, but if we can apply those skills, if we can apply those values, I think we have seen a lot of people, especially in Zambia. They say he's an educated fool. He's, sentences like that might mean that you have gone through the ladder of schooling or of school, and you have completed your high school. Maybe you have even gone to college. You have completed your diploma or degree, but you do not have values that the community will appreciate. You do not have the attitudes even towards work. Yeah, if you look at people who are educated, as I will talk about indigenous education, if you are educated to get paid and not to love what you do, your attitude, what is your attitude towards what you are doing? Anyway, let me not preempt this subject. Let me talk about the meaning of education. The meaning of the word education actually is based on a framework, and that framework comes from a philosophical view or a point of view of a particular group of people. For example, formal education is built on Western philosophies of education. Philosophers like Piaget, Vygotsky shaped education as we see it today. And in the more contemporary um, times, we see scholars or philosophers like Pestalozzi having their influence on how we are teaching our children in schools. Actually, in Zambia today, we have Pestalozzi schools, we have Montessori schools, and our parents that have got children are very proud to go to those schools because of the philosophy behind those schools, or the way they are teaching children. It is fashionable to find a parent saying, "Oh, mwana wanga aenda ku Montessori school," because we don't even know who Montessori was, but we believe in a way of teaching, way of transmitting knowledge. Now, what happens in the classroom is just knowledge transfer. It's just knowledge transfer from the teacher to the learner, and also knowledge creation between the learners and the teacher and among the learners. You'll find that there is knowledge creation. So that whole process is based on a particular philosophy. And it is that philosophy that determines what the learners are going to acquire at the end of the day, what values, what skills, what knowledge, and how they're going to use those skills. So, if education is built on a particular framework or philosophy, it simply means that education then is not so much of a place, it is so much of a process. It is a process of knowledge acquisition and knowledge transfer. We learn and we teach younger ones, and they teach their young ones, and the process continues like that. And learning in the African, let me not go there first. Let me just say that education is an activity that we can engage in anywhere. Like I've said, no venue. There shouldn't be. We shouldn't be restricted to the classroom. So this leads me to talk about what Indigenous education is. Indigenous education is a type of education that focuses on teaching indigenous knowledges. Now, there are myriads of indigenous knowledge systems because there are myriads of indigenous groups of people around the world, and each indigenous group or even within the region, for example in Africa, you have the Bantu people, the Nilotes, and um, the different indigenous groups of Africa who live there. They've got different ways of transferring, of creating knowledge, and how they transfer that knowledge to their children. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the Bantu people of Africa because that is where I come from. I've got first-hand experience with the people, and also I am I have grown up in that system, so it will be just be very easy for me to give examples. Then, if you have noticed, there is a growing concern to talk about indigenous education, indigenous knowledge, indigenous businesses. So the question is, what is it that is making people to start talking about indigenous education? The There is one thing that we need to understand about the growing recognition and use of indigenous education and methods, because this has become a response to the erosion and loss of indigenous knowledge systems. It's like people, indigenous people are losing their indigenous cultures, they are losing their indigenous knowledge systems as a result of the process of colonialism, globalization, and modernity. People want to live in the modern world and therefore want to behave like modern people. And the people want to adapt to global trends, especially with the coming of social media, where we can almost instantly see something that is happening in the different in another part of the world. So because of that, we see that there is an erosion of of indigenous knowledge systems. There is no adherence to indigenous knowledge systems, and as a result, there is need to begin to teach knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge systems, and to teach children to appreciate the values, the norms, and the skills that they can learn through an indigenous method. So, if indigenous knowledge and the skills is embedded in indigenous philosophies, I would love to talk about the Bantu people of East and Southern Africa. In the truest sense of the word Bantu, as a philosophy, not the word Bantu meaning people, but as a philosophy behind the term Bantu, all Africans living in sub-Saharan Africa are Bantu people because they have got one characteristic, which is connections and relations to the land, to the environment, and to the spiritual existence, or to God, in short. So Africans, as a people, are people who are connected to their ancestors. So education among the Bantu people is captured in the Ubuntu worldview, which advocates for these connections I've been talking about, where people feel connected to their land. Actually, where I come from, it is very important that when a child is born, they cut the umbilical cord and bury it in the land where the person came from. And in most cases, if someone dies, they make a request to be buried with their fathers in the same place where they came from. It's because we are connected to the place where we were born, and we are connected to the people in those areas and other people. Just the other day, my Chinese friend was asking me what my tribe was. Now, that is very important in establishing relationships, to know your tribe, to know your clan, and also to know the neighbors. So Ubuntu is a very important perspective in understanding how then in this framework education can be transmitted to the younger generation. Actually, if you read a book chapter by Gwamfobe, he argues that the African view of the universe is theocentric, holistic, pronatalist in social thought and value orientation. This simply means that when Africans thinking about whatever they are thinking, when they look at the world, they know, they recognize the presence of God. Somehow they recognize the presence of God as creator, or whichever way. And then it's holistic, meaning that they do not look life at individual principles or characteristics, but they look at life as a total sum of the environment, as a total sum of people, and as a total sum of whatever is within their own universe. And the pronatalist simply means that having children among African people is very important, because that is what signifies perpetual thriving and continuity within the communities. So African people are people who believe that children are very important, and therefore education must start at the time that a woman is conceived. Now, the education actually of children in the African worldview or the Ubuntu worldview does not start with the child. It starts with the mother. When the mother is pregnant, the mother will be taught what food she can eat, what places she can visit, and things that she can do or not do. For example, there were teachings through myths where women were told, do not eat eggs when you are pregnant for reasons that were known. Those the explanation may not be correct according to Western science, but the point I'm trying to make is that Africans are people that believe in the existence. Sorry, are people that believe in passing knowledge to the mother who is pregnant, and then those lessons are also taught to the child who is yet to be born. Mothers are encouraged to sing to their children so that the children can learn, or the child who is in the tummy, in simple language, can learn to uh, recognize the voice of the mother. Fathers are encouraged to touch the belly of the pregnant wife so that they can, that connection can start forming before the child is born. And this belief, actually, it is different from the Western orientation where they say learning begins at birth, everything begins at birth. Look, another issue that I can give an example, um, when we talk about gender in Western societies, just listen to most debates that are going on. They say there are two genders. For example, when Westerners argue about that, they say there are two genders and these are assigned at birth. But in the African worldview, we don't assign sorry, we don't assign gender. Gender, someone, you are born who you are. And this is, I don't want to use the word assign because it feels like you are born, you are a man, you are born, you are a woman. No. In the African way of life, or in the African view of the world, when the child is still in the womb of the mother, gender is determined at conception. By the time the child is born, they already have a gender which was determined at conception. So it's very important to begin to understand that issue. So this way of life that requires you to understand these connections is very important in establishing how you are going to teach your children, to teach them values, morals, and to teach them whatever that is there to be learned. So, how was indigenous education conducted? And then we should start looking at how our children are learning today in the Montessori schools, in the formal school. In short, the curriculum was not written because it was based on the environment, whatever was happening in the environment. If you lived in an environment where people depended on farming, it means your curriculum was tailored exactly to farming and you knew how to plant um, crops and how to fertilize the soil within that environment. If you lived among the hunter gatherers, then you learned geography. You needed to know your environment. You needed to read your environment to thrive in that environment. So the curriculum was framed according to where you were, and it was tacitly sequenced according to expected milestones of children. So children children's developmental stages determined what they were going to be learned. So, elders of the community, the family, and the siblings were involved in teaching children. There were topics that young people could not teach their friends. For example, sexual matters. For example, parents could not teach their children, they would send those children to be taught by their grandmothers and their aunties. Now, was there formal education? Yes, all these things we are talking about, learning through participating in the activities at home, learning from your parents at home, which is still happening, by the way. So we are not talking about things that do not happen. If you look at the way we learn, the first teacher, it is said, are your parents, and then you move to the community, and then you go to school. So even before teachers begin to teach a child has learned a lot of things, a lot of skills and values from their parents. But unfortunately, with the coming of formal education, we do not treat what we learn at home or outside the classroom as valuable knowledge, valuable skills, and valuable information that we can use. And therefore, when the curriculum is created today, it is not created to address the social and economic needs that we are faced with. So the other day, I posted something on Facebook, and one friend of mine, Mr. Mtika, made a very good observation. He said, in Chama, people grow rice. However, there is nothing in the syllabus in Chama district or even in Zambia, maybe, which shows people how to grow rice. And guys, let me just say this, there's always a difference between learning about rice and learning how to actually plant rice, harvest, and use it. And when you learn, how do you make money out of what you are learning? Most of us, yes, have been taken to schools and been educated to understand a lot of stuff, but what we do not have is the entrepreneurial ideas of how to turn the opportunity into money. That kind of education is not just there because the curriculum doesn't seem to support or to favor indigenous knowledge systems, and how we can work on those indigenous knowledges so that people can liberate themselves from poverty. So the education system within Ubuntu framework leaned cooperation and living together, which were like major themes. So if we lived together and formed connections, it meant then therefore that children's education was held by everyone in that community. Other adults were actually given the responsibility to reprimand the children and teach them good norms and on good behaviors and good ways of living with other people within the community. The connections within the African societies, especially among the Bantu people, are very important in understanding how knowledge was created and how it was transferred. And we can use it to differentiate what is happening today. The venues of education, indigenous education, were, like I've already mentioned, the home, the playground, the funeral house. All these were venues. However, there was a special venue for formal education within indigenous education, which was um, places where ceremonies were conducted. In Zambia, I think we still have a very important ceremony which happened among the boys, Mukanda ceremony in northwestern province, where young men are taken in a secluded place and there's a man or there are men teaching them there, introducing them to adult life. And the processes there are so organized, so systematic that, yes, it is formal education. And actually, scholars like Kwamfobe argue that formal education during the pre-colonial period was most strongly manifested in the form of the initiation ceremony. And significant to indigenous formal education were life lessons which were given in secluded places for boys and girls. When boys and girls are taken to those places to be taught, it is so formalized and organized, and there's always a teacher who is an expert in an area that is being taught to the girls or the boys in those secluded places. So the initiation ceremony, in short, wherever it happens in Africa, signifies a lot of formalism, and it is characterized by teaching and learning of materials which is drawn from the spiritual, um, the physical, the social, and the environmental settings. Like I said, Bant people are connected to their land, to their environment. And when I talk about land, I am talking about land and its physical um, material, its physical material, like mountains and trees and everything that is on land, and then the spiritual world. So the lessons that come from there hinge on that. And within this training, there is the training for special occupations. Now, special occupations that these young people would participate in. I am coming back to the point of in the Bemba land of what we call Insaka and Ichibwanze. Insaka is just a group of men where they sit and chat and they share ideas and knowledge, and young people are allowed to sit there. Among the women, there is what we call um, Ichibwanze. Ichibwanze, it's a group for women. They sit there, they teach young ones, and those young ones grow up. It continues. It is something that goes. It's a cycle. It's a process. A lot of lessons, life lessons, are given there, and children who go to those places learn a lot. In the Eastern Province, I think you can think of it in terms of is it Kumtondo or Kumpala? I don't know which one is for the men. I don't know which one is for the women, but those are very important for you to think about. And Just see how they were conducting their education. So, what was the language policy? How was the language used? And I like this because some people have told me that language has got nothing to do with what we are learning because we can understand English. Now, Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya, he's a novelist, he's a playwright. He wrote one novel. Sorry, he wrote one book where he was talking about decolonizing literature in Africa. So, how can we decolonize it? In commenting on the language policy during before the colonial period, he says um something that is very important. I'll just read it for you so that you get what you can get from there. He says, "We spoke Gikuyu as we worked in the fields. We spoke Gikuyu in and outside the home. I can vividly recall those evenings of storytelling at the fireside. It was mostly the grown ups telling the children, but everybody was interested and involved. We children would retell the stories the following day to other children who worked in the fields. Cooperation as the ultimate good in a community was a constant theme. The language, through images and symbols, gave a view of the world, but it had a beauty of its own. The home and the field were then our pre primary school. But what is important to this discussion is that the language of our evening teachings and the language of our immediate and wider community and the language of our work in the fields were one. And then I went to school, a colonial school. This harmony was broken. The language of my education was no longer the language of my culture. Question: is it possible to use a foreign language to describe your worldview, including the principles that make up that worldview? I am talking about burnt people of Africa or the people of sub-Saharan Africa who are not deemed actually, who are connected to their land, to their environment, and to the spiritual existence or to the existence of God. Can you use a language to describe and to give the image? Because Thiongo actually says it says that cooperation as the ultimate good in community was a constant theme. The language, through images and symbols, gave a view of the world. Now, my question: is it possible to have a clear view of the world using a different language that is detached to that environment? Now, when you look at language, it becomes very important in situating education and also decentering. And when I say decentering Euro Western, it means our education system, at the center of our education system, it's Euro Western ideas of education. How do we push these away so that our indigenous education can come to the center? It is through the use of languages, local languages. Now, again, there is a lot that we can say about language, but because everything that we learn from high school, most of it are just definitions, just learning how to define. We really do not learn to do, to act, to behave, because you find that someone has been to school, all they know are definitions, but they can't do anything with those definitions. Apart from learning those definitions, the difficulty of just understanding things in a different language adds to this problem. So we can see that language creates a harmony, as Ngugi actually argued. He said the language of the teachings, the language of play, the language of work, and the language of home was the same. And when he went to school, the harmony was broken. why he could no longer understand his own environment because now it is being described using a different language. And if your own environment is being described in a different language, how can you take advantage of your own environment and use it to your and use it to your advantage? I go back to my question. Sorry, to my example about rice growing in Chama. Why is it that the syllabus does not have? Why is it that the syllabus does not have ways of Chama people to grow their rice? Why is it that people are not studying that knowledge? I've got a friend and a brother who is working in the Ministry of Agriculture. They've been doing a lot of research. I don't know how much research they are conducting on indigenous crops and how we can improve indigenous ways of fertilizing the soil rather than depending on Ukraine and Russia. So, guys, these are some of the things that we need to think about when we begin to ponder about indigenous education. So, what could be then the importance of indigenous education? Like I said at the beginning, there has been growing concern of trying to bring back indigenous education in our schools because there is loss of culture. So, indigenous education can help us to preserve and pass down traditional languages, customs, and knowledges that are very important to the development and perpetuation of our cultures, our traditions, and our ways of improving our lives. It can be used actually if we start talking about indigenous education in our schools, and you'll see that a lot of people will be empowered as a result because then they will understand things from their own perspective. And then we can also address historical injustices. We know that indigenous education acknowledges historical injustices, including colonialism and forced assimilation. I think when we talk about forced assimilation, we are talking about what the French were doing to the former colonial states in Africa, where they assimilated them into their culture, and the people forget who they are, forgot themselves. And it is very important that we need to give this knowledge to the young generation so that we can go back to who we are and do things our own way that fits within our environment. And through indigenous education, through indigenous ways of doing, we can bring about sustainable development. Because for most of the people actually who are not rich, they just need simple ways of improving their own lives. So indigenous knowledge often includes valuable insights into sustainable practices and environmental stewardship, making indigenous education essential in the context of ecological and environmental challenges. Then we can also build stronger communities because education within indigenous communities helps to build stronger self-reliant communities with improved access to healthcare. And then when we talk about healthcare, we're not just talking about going to the hospital, we're also talking about studying our own indigenous medicines to improve our own health. Economic opportunities. How can we use the education that relates to our problem to solve our own problems? And social well-being and ultimately contributing to the more equitable society. How can we do that? Indigenous education is a way to go. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying we should abolish the curriculum in order to bring indigenous education into the school system. I am saying, can we create a situation where we bring both Western and indigenous education so that even as we learn what is going now on in the Western scientific community, we should not forget the grassroots problems that we are faced with and how we can solve those problems. It is very important. So we are not going back to indigenous knowledge forsaking Western education. We are just including, or we are advocating for the inclusion of indigenous knowledges. And in fact, some of you may not know that the 2013 curriculum in Zambia is advocating for developing a policy, or as advocated for the provision of formal education which is localized. Now, it is not enough that they have said that, but at least there's something in the curriculum that talks about localizing education so that it can meet the demands on the ground, or so that it can meet alleviate problems on the ground with people. Indigenous education ideas in general have been marginalized by European compartmentalized and structured education. What do I mean? At the beginning of this presentation, I said that indigenous education is holistic. Everything is viewed as a whole instead of parts. When you go to school, and again, don't get me wrong, I am not saying it is wrong to separate subjects according to their levels and according to the different subjects like science, physics, chemistry. But in real life, we don't separate things like that. And African indigenous education does not separate. It's more like integrated lesson. Again, this feature of teaching integrated lessons, you will find it, especially with the preschool teachers in government. They are using a method where they are teaching integrated science. For example, teaching literacy and mathematics at the same time in one lesson. This, for me, is a plus towards moving towards a holistic approach to lessons where you do not bombard children with numbers only and then they move to another subject where they feel like, oh, okay, it's now language. I'm so happy we no longer doing mathematics. Imagine if we taught both all the sciences as a subject, because it is just a body of knowledge. And if we can find a way of teaching this subject in an integrated way, we'll be so happy. Now, if you look at the school system today, it is a direct mirror of Western developmentally appropriate practices emanating from pioneers like Piaget, Vygotsky, and others like Robert Owens, Frederick Froebel, John Heinrich Pestalozzi. I think most of you are very familiar with Pestalozzi because you can see Pestalozzi schools. Margaret Macmillan and Maria Montessori, all these are scholars that came up with good ideas of teaching children. But what we are saying is that what if we can add holistic methods that come from indigenous methods, practical methods of teaching instead of um, theoretical and bookish kind of reading. You do one thing before I forget. One thing I found that was interesting in for learners in preschool was the fact that children in Zambia at the age of 5 they are using the phonics method of learning. Now, I'll explain to you what that phonics method is. The phonics method is the method of teaching literacy by analyzing letters and then you build. So it's in Zambia, actually, the curriculum says they are using synthetic, I don't know if it's synthetic phonics or analytic phonics, but synthetic method is where you'd use like ka, a, la, a, to form the word kalata. Now, that is very good, but that method is very torturous to the children. If I were teaching, I would advocate for the whole word approach. Just show the child the whole way, and say, because one thing that we need to remember is that when we read, we actually do not read every letter of the word. We just look at the shape of the word. Look at the first two letters, look at the shape, then we read. Sometimes we begin and then we end the wrong way because we necessarily don't read, in most cases, what is on paper. We read what is in the mind. So if children can know the shapes of words, while combining the phonics method. That would be a great, great idea. But I want to thank the Zambian government, especially for the children in preschool and the teachers that I interacted with. They are now using what they call learning corners or learning areas. Learning areas are used all over the world, just like you divide the classroom and you put children in groups, but they are not just ordinary groups like sitting group in groups and no, no, no. Each corner is stuffed with different props for teaching or teaching aids. So if it's a home corner, you have you have things like the stove, the cupboard, things that you find at home, and they're actually in the classroom. Now, that is true learning because if you tell a child this is a fridge and they have a fridge in the classroom, that makes much more sense, and the child will not forget because they are not just memorizing a word using the phonics method where they are dividing a word into letters. They are also looking at what a fridge is. So they've got a mental picture of what they are learning about. And they also have the word on the board, so they can read and look at that stuff. If it's a literacy corner, there are a lot of props for teaching literacy, and these things are found in the classroom. And this is what we are talking about when we say practical learning, and the teacher is there. And I'm sure of late we've been seeing teachers playing with the children, dancing with the children, because dance, for example, is one of the best ways of teaching in African indigenous knowledge. And we have seen these videos gone on viral where teachers are dancing with the learners and they are singing together, they are clapping, making it very interesting for the learners even to attend school. Because when school becomes torturous, ndepa japakuti, you don't want to go to school because it's hard. Now, I don't think there was anyone in indigenous education who failed at anafeluka. I don't think we had such a situation as failing because the learning there was very practical. You were involved, actively involved with your mind, with your body, with your hands. Everything was involved. You were participating. And school itself was not judged in terms of exams. Yes, exams were there because you would now be given a task to accomplish alone without the guidance of the adult who was teaching you. But it was in a very relaxed environment. You didn't even know how you were cruising in your acquisition of knowledge and values. And if we can bring that to the classroom to make it interesting for the learners, to help the learners acquire knowledge in ways that feel that like they are working on something, that is very, very important, and it's going to help us improve our education. However, I must be quick to mention that while we can talk about all these things, we need to think that indigenous education then must be very expensive, because if children are going to learn in a classroom in a practical way, it means every classroom must be equipped with everything that they need for every subject. If I were in power, or if I had the power to change things, maybe I wouldn't have schools teaching everything. I would have schools teaching specialized subjects. So for people that are into agriculture, we create schools where it's more of agriculture. And when schools sit to plan to buy resources, they know they are focusing on agric and science, for example. The way we have schools like DK, which are technical schools, you know what to focus on as a school. It becomes so difficult for schools to manage to buy resources for all the different subjects because you've got a wide range of subjects. How do you just buy the materials? And we lack infrastructure. We lack infrastructure. I am so glad with the opportunity to teach at different schools in Lusaka. I noticed that some schools have got equipment, they've got infrastructure, and so if you are teaching things like carpentry, you are teaching things like technical drawing, like at DK, they have what it takes for a learner to acquire the knowledge. They've got all those things, but some schools, as a sorry site, there's nothing there. So it is important that then we look to indigenous materials. And again, I go back to the preschool teachers that I had an interaction with. They were actively involved in, using indigenous materials like bottles, like card boxes, how they made card boxes, they made houses, they made a lot of things. And one thing that of particular interest to me was the fact that these teachers were not making these materials at home. They were making materials with the learners in the classroom. So you are imagine you are creating a learning material, and imagine that when you are creating that learning material, you are creating it with the learner. So the learner does not just learn about what you are going to use, but they also know how to make that. That was very interesting for me. And in particular, I believe if the Ministry of Education can go and lean so much on that kind of learning, then we will, I think, we'll be getting somewhere. Truthfully speaking, indigenous knowledge systems are there in the classroom, but it takes astute teachers to recognize and how to use them. So, using learning corners and local languages, I think there has been an improvement in the way the children are learning. They are asking questions. They are doing whatever they can within their powers. It is important. We need to remember this, that education is education. And this, I'm getting to the conclusion. I am saying education is education regardless of where you acquire it. You can acquire it in the classroom, you can acquire it outside the classroom. Now, let me share two important things I have learned. I have learned here in Australia. Number one, in Australia, they recognize your prior experience as part of the training when you enroll for vet courses, vocational and educational training. So if you enroll in one of those courses, they say we don't actually, they don't focus on what you acquired, sorry, on how you acquired your knowledge. They are focused on what you acquired, whether that knowledge came through experience, and they're teaching a particular course that is related to what you already know. You'll be exempted from that course because you have been doing it, so there's no need to learn things that you already know. In Zambia, experience does not count. What counts is whether you learn something from a different institution, then you'll be exempted. Otherwise, experience is not counted. Now, the question for me is, how can they exempt you from what they're teaching in class when they know what is happening outside the class is different to what they are teaching? In short, the curriculum in Zambia is not related to what is on the ground. So it is difficult for them to exempt you, because even if you have got so much experience, you've been a farmer in Chipata for 10 years and you go to get your certificate in general agriculture, they cannot exempt you, not even in one unit, because what they are teaching you there is not what is happening. So vet courses should be tailored to the actual things that are happening. So do a research, find out what is happening on the ground, and teach those things. Another thing I have come to learn from here is what they call a two-way education. So the government of Australia, in recognition of indigenous people, they have introduced what they call cultural ways of learning, which they include in the syllabus to create a two-way education system. Now, i- including Western and indigenous ways is a subject that has been written about by so many scholars. But I like what one scholar said or wrote in 2015. Gupta said that when we include indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems, we are creating a third space. So the first space is the space where indigenous lessons are given. The second space is a space where Western knowledge and skills are given. The third space combines the two. And Gupta argues that the third space of pedagogical hybridity, meaning when we create a curriculum that is a hybrid of both indigenous and Western knowledges, this kind of space emerges from three distinct discourses, including cultural, number one, colonial, two, number three, progressive pedagogies, and educational philosophies. Now, this is very important in concluding this discussion because you cannot create a form of education that is not built on any philosophies, or you cannot create an education system that is built on borrowed philosophies. For example, you borrow philosophies from Montessori, Maria Montessori, or you borrow philosophies from Pestalozzi or from Vygotsky, and you want to adapt them. I don't think you can shoehorn or graft things like that. You cannot, that is an imposition of knowledge on people. The best way is to graft and create a third space of pedagogical hybridity where this hybrid curriculum can be used to bring indigenous knowledge to the fore. This will lead to centering knowledge or centering African children at the at the core of education. When we learn, should we feel like we are educated to go to America, we are educated to go to UK, or we should feel like, oh, I'm educated to explore my environment, and I am educated to explore my environment so that I can benefit from it. Yeah, so we can think about these things and we see how it goes. So once again, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, as usual, please comment on it, share it. The more you comment, the more Facebook or YouTube algorithms will be in my favor. It will suggest Facebook will suggest this video to other people. So just like it or comment on it and share it. Thank you so much. I'll hear from you again. Bye bye.